Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. So today I wanted to talk about Burning Furiously Beautiful, the true story of Jack Kerouac's On the Road. So what this book is basically, it's the true story of Jack Kerouac's On the Road. It takes the events that are depicted in Jack Kerouac's novel On the Road and tells what actually happened, the real life story that was depicted in On the Road. And it gives a lot of background on his life leading up to On the Road, and it talks a lot about the process of him writing it, the process of him getting it published, and everything about his life that went along with On the Road. So I wanted to share the major insights, major things I took away from reading this that I really enjoyed. So in the very beginning of this book, he talks about comparing the Beat generation to the Lost generation and how similar those two generations were, because they both, are focused on a group of writers that wrote all of their works after World War I, which is the Lost generation, and World War II, which is the Beat generation. And the key difference that these authors discussed as the differences between the Lost generation and the Beat generation. Since the Lost generation, all those writers left America. They all went to Europe. They all were very disillusioned with America and just completely packed up their stuff and left and went to Europe and did all their writings outside of America. But the Beat generation, they stayed in America after World War II. They didn't go out and travel around the world, and they just stayed right here in America. I mean, they all had very difficult lives, in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. But they focused on finding good things in life, finding things they liked in America, and writing about that. I mean, they had very difficult lives. I mean, the word beat usually is depicted as, beat, like you're just beat down. But, I've talked in previous videos about how Jack Kerouac, the word beat actually meant beatitude, like finding what's good in life, finding what's pure and holy in life. And that's really what they focused on. But I think the reason they focused on that was because they had such hard lives. They had to work hard to find meaning in life when they had such a difficult past. And Jack Kerouac's childhood was marked by quite a few tragedies. One event in particular is the death of his brother Gerard. That really had a major impact on Jack Kerouac's childhood and just his family in general. And growing up, he lived in the French neighborhood of the town of Lowell in Massachusetts, which was the neighborhood he lived in was known as Little Canada. So in his childhood, he really felt like an outsider in America. He didn't ever felt like a true American growing up. So I think that definitely had a lot of impact on the way he saw America. He just saw himself as an outsider his whole life, and that's very reflective of how he saw himself the rest of his life. And one major thing I liked about this book, it did a really good job explaining his life right before the events of On the Road, the years before that, when he was in college, when he was in the Merchant Marines. Especially when he was in the Merchant Marines, he really lived a life that was on the road at sea. During World War II, he was in the Merchant Marines. He went to Greenland and parts of Europe, and up and down the East Coast. He traveled, through the Merchant Marines. So he really did quite a bit of traveling, before on the road. It really wasn't his first time going out and exploring. He did a lot of that when he was in the Merchant Marines. And it goes into detail about how, he was very in and out of college. He never really knew what he wanted to do. He was just a very lost individual. And I think being in the Merchant Marines was kind of a way just for him to have something to do without having necessarily any direction in his life. And this book also talks a great deal about Jack Kerouac's involvement in a murder. His friend Lucien Carr murdered someone, and Jack Kerouac was with him when he buried some of the evidence. So Jack Kerouac was initially arrested for being part of that murder. He eventually got released when it was determined that he wasn't necessarily involved enough to be in jail, to be arrested for it. And after that, he ended up getting married, and that he ended up getting divorced very soon after. Then he went back to sea in the Merchant Marines, and then he ended up abandoning the Merchant Marines when they were in North Carolina. He quit, and then he ended up joining the Navy, and he didn't like it in the Navy. He ended up making himself appear that he was crazy. I think his diagnosis was schizophrenia, even though he did not have schizophrenia. He was looking for any way to get out of the Navy once he was in it, because he didn't fit in. He wasn't someone that was going to fit in the military. That was very obvious. He just was someone who was very focused on himself, very focused on being an individual. And that's the way a lot of the people in the Beat generation were. They were just very focused on finding meaning as an individual. They weren't people that were going to be very happy being in the military. Because a lot of people that Jack Kerouac focuses on in his writing weren't necessarily very nice people. He describes it as finding saints in madmen. So he takes people who aren't very nice people necessarily and writes about them in a very good way, especially Neil Cassidy, who he calls him a con man. But he still finds a lot of good qualities that he writes about Neal Cassady. So he's just really focusing on finding good things in life and in other people, despite negative qualities and negative experiences that he went through. But in Jack Kerouac's early years before the events of On the Road, really see that he's a person that really focuses on questioning truth, questioning reality, rejecting the establishment, and that's just very prominent themes in beat literature, and just the direction of counterculture itself in the decades after World War II. I think even before counterculture entered pop culture, this idea of rejecting the mainstream was a very popular thing in the 1950s. You see a lot of James Dean influence, I think. I think the reason that someone like James Dean or Marlon Brando became very popular during the 1950s is because everyone was into rejecting this very conformist 1950s atmosphere that existed in America. And this book also talks about how James Dean himself, his life, was probably also a major reason why On the Road was so popular, because the character Dean Moriarty in On the Road, the name Dean is right there. And James Dean, he died in 1955, right before his movie The Rebel Without a Cause came out. He died in a car accident. So in the 1950s, this idea of just driving around America in a car was a very new thing. And I think his death in the car accident really, it kind of gave this rough edge to cars and driving. And, the book On the Road, about cars, this major character, with the name Dean, who I feel like Dean Moriarty was seen as a very James Dean type character in the book. So you see the influence very, very deep in, how the popular culture of the 1950s really, it also influenced On the Road and made On the Road very successful. But I think what that's getting at is that, On the Road, Jack Kerouac and the Beat Generation, they're very much a part of the postmodern art era. The way that James Dean represented rejection of mainstream society. And they also saw in Elvis Presley, even in Jackson Pollock, Robert Frank, Arthur Miller, all these major individuals in different genres of art were definitely doing similar things in rejecting mainstream society. I think what this book did a really good job doing was explaining the writing process of On the Road. So Jack Kerouac was writing on the road while he was on the road, basically. I mean, he went through many drafts, many different ideas of how he could write a road novel. He was trying to write a road novel before he even went on the road. So I think what the actual book On the Road leaves out is how much writing he was doing while he was on the road, trying to write this road novel. I think a lot of his traveling around America was trying to understand America so he could write about it. But in the end, his process of traveling around America ended up being his road novel itself. And also his process of writing his first novel, The Town and the City, also had a big influence on the events of On the Road. Because during those On the Road years, he spent a lot of time writing and getting, The Town and the City published. I think one of the biggest events that took place in Jack Kerouac's real life that wasn't depicted in On the Road that took place during those years was his move to Denver. He moved to Denver for a couple months, right in the middle of the events of On the Road, with his mother, and I believe his sister moved in there too. But he went there to try to find inspiration to write, because in the book On the Road, Denver is seen as this emerald city, that this magical place that he just dreams of going. And he's only there for I think like 10 days during his initial trip there in the book On the Road. And he goes back there a couple times, but he wasn't there for a very, very long period of time. It was just here and there, traveling, passing through. But he finally just made the decision to move there. And when he moved there, all of his friends that he associated with Denver were no longer living in Denver. All of the Beat Generation was living in New York and San Francisco at that point. So when he went to Denver, I think he was very much alone, and he really failed to find inspiration because the magic of Denver just wasn't there anymore. And he ended up being very depressed when he was there and ended up leaving. But I think what this really says is that Jack Kerouac was always looking for a home. He was always trying to find somewhere that he could live, somewhere he would really like to be long term. And he never found that, and that's why he traveled so much. He was constantly just searching for somewhere that he would like to stay. Because for most of his life, he lived with his mother. Even when he died in his 40s, he was still living with his mother. And throughout the events of his life, you see that he's constantly visiting his ex-wife in Detroit, which is also something that's not depicted in the original book On the Road. It doesn't really talk about how many times he visited his ex-wife in Detroit during his travels. So that really, I think, emphasizes that he really was struggling to find a sense of self. And also, this book talks about how Jack Kerouac had this dream at one point in his life of starting this communal ranch out in the Denver area. He wanted Neal Cassady, his wife, to move there, and he talked about having other people move there. So he wanted to start this communal ranch that they could all live on together and work and share everything. And also that just goes along with his way that he's trying to find his own family and life. I think that's just the way that people were trying to redefine what family meant in this era of conformity, which I think really, this process of trying to redefine family life really took off in the 1960s with the counterculture. But going back to Jack Kerouac's process of writing the book, The Town and the City, this talks about how after The Town and the City came out, a lot of the reviews of the book were very poor, and he got very, very depressed, very, very saddened by how much of a failure The Town and the City was. And he ended up, after that, going on this trip to Mexico to try to get away and just party and just kind of forget about all of the negative things he felt about the failure of The Town and the City. And that's really left out of the book On the Road. I mean, his trip to Mexico is in there, but it doesn't really talk about, his depression related to The Town and the City right before that. And that was kind of the, I think, initial factor that caused him to go there, which is really not discussed in the original book On the Road. But I think what this book makes clear more than anything else is what a horrible person Jack Kerouac was, what a horrible person Neal Cassady was. They just weren't very nice people at all. They constantly abandoned their wives. Jack Kerouac was married 3 times. Neal Cassady had 3 different wives, and they constantly left them and their children. Jack Kerouac refused to acknowledge his only daughter, for most of his life. I mean, he eventually, I think, admitted that she was his daughter, but he just kind of left her and his ex-wife. Neal Cassady was constantly abandoning his wife and his children. And they just weren't very nice people. They just were focused on adventure, focused on their own selves. They weren't people that were real family people. But I also think that says a lot about the Beat Generation itself, because, the Beat Generation was about rejecting mainstream family values, basically. So it makes sense that they weren't family people, they weren't very nice people. But it's also just very reflective of where counterculture was going to go in the coming decades. And this book also talks a great deal about when Jack Kerouac finally wrote On the Road, when he was trying to find inspiration to write the events of On the Road, and how much he was influenced by Neal Cassady's writing. But by the year 1950, Jack Kerouac, William Burroughs, John C. Holmes, all of these beat writers were really starting to write. They were really starting to hone in on this writing style that was influenced by Neal Cassady. So Jack Kerouac, even though he's the most well-known beat writer, wasn't the only person doing this. There were a lot of people writing during this time period. He just happened to be the one that got a book published at just the right time. It was written just the right way, just the right style, that happened to take off and be the Beat Generation novel that everyone remembers. But overall, I really enjoyed this book. I think what this book is for someone who just read On the Road, but they want to understand the greater context of the book. They want to understand the real life events. They want to understand the real characters that these characters in On the Road are based off of. I just want to understand more of the cultural and societal context of what was going on in America at that time, and why On the Road became so popular, and its effect on American counterculture in general. But if you're looking for a really good biography on Jack Kerouac, I don't think this is the book for you. I mean, this talks a great deal about his life and his life and the events that take place on the road, but it doesn't talk a lot about his life after On the Road, which I feel like other biographies of Jack Kerouac do a much better job doing. But if you want to understand the greater context of On the Road, this is definitely the book you want to read. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So that's Burning Furiously Beautiful. And be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next book review.